What is time, and how does it relate to motion? When we talk about measuring the future or the past, what is it that we're actually measuring? The future does not yet exist, and the past no longer exists. Does that mean we measure time in the present? Well, how long is the present? Where do we measure time if it seems not to exist in the future or in the past? Let's ask Augustine. Today we'll talk about Augustine's view of time. It comes from Augustine's Confessions, Book 11. Some background information. Augustine lived from 354 AD till 430, and he was at first a Manichaean. He was raised by his Catholic mother and his non-Christian father, and eventually as he grew up, he left Christianity and he went off and studied rhetoric and became a professional rhetorician. And along the way, he also studied philosophy, and he was attracted to a school of thought called Manichaean Ism. This is a school of thought that is dualist in its nature. Dualism says that good and evil are equal and opposite powers. You should look at my video on Augustine on evil for a little bit more discussion of Augustine's view of evil after he becomes a Christian, after he leaves Manichaeanism. Augustine is famous for being a Catholic bishop and also introducing Platonism into the Christian church and taking a lot of his philosophy from Plato and kind of adapting it for Christianity. He also developed much of Christian theology and philosophy at an early stage in the Christian church. His Confessions, his book, The Confessions, chronicles his intellectual journey and represents some of the most candid, deeply meditative, and eloquent philosophical writing. It is a sort of meditative autobiography where he shows his own story of how he became a Christian after leaving Manichaeanism. It's very philosophical, autobiographical, and quite personal as well. As he discusses time, one thing that is important is that he takes this idea that time is linear. This is an idea that was not popular yet, and it became popular after Augustine. So time, before Augustine, and in other worldviews, was most often considered some sort of cyclical happening, that the entire universe was cyclical in its nature rather than linear. And he takes some of this idea from Boethius. Boethius said that God is above time and separate and distinct from time. We'll see how that premise plays out in some of the rest of the discussion. But as Augustine discusses time, he says that time is linear. And for the most part, science today takes this idea and adopts it as well, thinking about time as linear. There is development through time. Cause and effect happens in one direction, and time is not often considered cyclical anymore. Even if events within time may be repeated, that is different than saying that time itself is cyclical. Now, Augustine's meditation on time comes in a long tradition of asking what preserves through change, and what is the nature of change. These questions started with the pre-Socratics, and you might want to look at my pre-Socratics video to see how they ask some of these questions. Augustine's motive in this meditation is to learn about God's creation and learn about God's character of aseity, that is, self-sufficiency. He sees that within time, things change. Objects change. They come into existence or go out of existence, but God does not. And God does not change according to his Christian doctrine. So how does change relate to God? How does creation relate to God? How does time relate to God? Augustine's meditation on the nature of time does not require agreement with his religious beliefs. So for those who are not religious or not Christian, a lot of his ideas can still be investigated, thought about, and even adopted to varying degrees just because of the merits of his own rationality. This often takes place, in the same way that Augustine adopts many of the ideas of Plato, who is not a Christian. In the same way, we who come after Augustine can adopt some of his ideas and not necessarily all of them. According to Augustine, God is timeless and without change. This is part of the nature of God, that God cannot change. If God is the greatest possible being, then he is without change, because change implies either becoming less good or becoming more good. But God is already perfected good and is already the most necessary and proper being. God is necessary and creation is contingent. This is to say that that creation does not have to exist. There's nothing about the world and the universe and material objects that there's no property about these physical objects that requires them to exist. They could exist or they could not exist. That means they're contingent. That means that something else caused their existence. But with God, God has the property where he has to exist. He's the necessary thing on which all contingent things depend. So this is just explaining some of Augustine's premises and assumptions before we get into his meditation. And time is part of creation and is present throughout the changing nature of contingent creation. All right, so the main question that we're asking is, what is time? What is it? Time is linear and God is above time. We've mentioned this. How do we measure time? How do we measure the past, present, or future? We say that song will take 5 minutes, but how do we know? We haven't measured it yet. We say that song took 5 minutes, but when did you measure it? These are some of the questions that Augustine asks when he's asking about the nature of time. If it is in the future, the event does not yet exist. If it's in the past, it has already stopped existing. The past and future, therefore, do not exist. If the song is present, I don't know how long it is until it is finished. But by then, it is no longer playing. What am I measuring after it has gone? The past no longer exists. The future does not yet exist. So how do you measure something that does not exist? Where is the time that I measure? Do I measure the past, the future, or the present? If the future and past don't exist, then it must be the present. But in the present, I cannot measure the duration of a song until it has already passed. Augustine says, nonetheless, we speak of a long time or a short time, and we do so only of time past or time in the future. For example, we call 100 years ago a long time in the past, and likewise 100 years hence a long time in the future. But we call, say, 10 days ago a short time in the past, and 10 days hence a short time in the future. But on what grounds can something that does not exist be called long or short? The past no longer exists, and the future does not yet exist. We ought not, therefore, to say that is a long time. But when we speak of the past, we should say, that was a long time, and of the future, that will be long. Now, human mind, let us consider whether present time can be long, as you seem to think it can, since you have been granted the power to be aware of duration and to measure it. So Augustine is delving deeper and deeper in his meditation. How long is the present? He asks. Is it a year? But some months are still future, and some are past. What about a day? How long is the present? Is it a day? But some hours are still future, and some are past. Even if you say the present is only a second, some portion of that second is still in the future, and some is still in the past. Augustine says, if we can conceive of a moment in time which cannot be further divided into even the tiniest of minute particles, that alone can be rightly termed the present. Yet even this flies by from future into the past with such haste that it seems to last no time at all. Even if it has some duration, that too is divisible into past and future. Hence, the present is reduced to vanishing point. Augustine says, what kind of time, then, can be referred to as a long time? Future time, perhaps? Then we must not say, that is a long time, because there is as yet nothing to be long. If at the point of speaking that period is still in the future, it will not be long, because nothing yet exists to be long. If, however, at the moment when we speak, it has begun to exist by emerging from the non-existent future, and so has become present, so that there is something in existence to be long, then this present time proclaims itself incapable of being long for the reasons already discussed. So the future does not yet exist. The past no longer exists, and the present is only a point. It seems that no time exists. When is duration? If it is in the future, it does not yet exist. If it is in the past, it no longer exists. But the present has no duration. Augustine says, we measure periods of time as they pass, so as to declare this interval twice as long as that, or this equal to that. If anyone asks me, how do you know that? I must be allowed to reply, I know it because we do in fact measure them. But what does not exist we cannot measure, and past and future do not exist. But how can we measure present time when it has no extension? We can only hope to measure it as it passes by, because once it has passed by, there will be no measuring it. It will not exist to be measured. It comes then from what is not yet real, travels through what occupies no space, and is bound for what is no longer real. But when it is measured, where does it come from? But what path does it pass, and whither go? Where from, if not from the future? So he's asking here, when it is measured, where does it come from? Where does it go? And by what path does it travel? But what are we trying to measure, if not time that does not have some extension? We speak of half as long, double the time, or 3 times as long. So if we measure time in the present, and the present has no duration, then doesn't that mean that we can't measure it? So by what mechanism do we measure time? Augustine says, I was once told by a certain learned man that the movements of the sun, moon, and stars themselves constitute time. I did not agree with him. Why, in that case, should not the movements of all corporeal things constitute time? He says, suppose the luminaries of heaven were to halt. Suppose the sun were to stop, and the stars were to stop moving. But a potter's wheel went on turning. would there not still be time by which we could measure those rotations and say either that all of them took the same time, or, if the speed of the wheel varied, that some were of longer duration and others shorter? If we measure time by comparing one object to another, is there a certain object whose movements are the ultimate measuring standard? All right, so we measure how long this video is by minutes, and minutes are based on a division of the day, and the day is defined by the Earth's rotation and how the sun sheds light on the Earth. But what if the Earth were to stop rotating? What would that do to the minute? Well, we could always measure the length of this video in, let's say, heartbeats. How many times does my heart beat? Something along those lines. Is there an ultimate standard? Augustine says no. It can't be the movement of a physical object that provides the ultimate standard. Let's look at an example. Which ruler is closer to 4 inches long on your screen? Can you use ruler B to measure whether ruler A is 4 inches or not, just looking at these? No, because you don't know how long either ruler is. You can't measure one with the other and say which is closer to 4 inches. You need an external standard. You need to go find a real ruler and hold it up to your screen. But how do you know if your ruler is accurate? Perhaps it was made wrong and is just a little too short or too long. How would you know? Would you go use another ruler? What if that one is wrong? We need something external to measure these two rulers, and so it can continue as an infinite regress. How do you know how long this thing is? You need some sort of standard by which to measure it. What is external to time, by which we can measure time? How can we measure time? If the planets stop moving, we use a stopwatch to see how long the pause is. But what if the stopwatch stops also? Or what if it's too slow or too fast? We can use our heartbeat to measure time, for example. But what if that stops or slows down? Different people have different heart rates. What if something causes all of these things to slow down? Suppose we continue living and our heartbeat has stopped. We continue living somehow, just for the sake of argument, and we can count in our mind, perhaps, and measure time with our consciousness. But what if our mind slows down or stops? If everything in the universe slowed down at the same rate and at the same time, we wouldn't notice because we would have no external referent. If the entire universe slowed down or sped up, how would we be aware of it? Because our mind and any mechanism we would use to measure time would also speed up or slow down. What does this say about the nature of time and how to measure it? Augustine says, "My question now is not, therefore, what is it that we call a day, but what is time itself, the time whereby we would be able to measure the sun's revolution and say that it had been completed in only half of the usual time, if the circuit had occupied only that space of time represented by 12 hours. Therefore, if the motion of an object is one thing, and the standard by which we measure its duration another, is it not obvious which of the two has the stronger claim to be called time?" So this is Augustine's evidence for showing how we cannot say that time is the motion of a physical object, but rather that time somehow is separate from physical objects, and time measures the movement of physical objects. So time is something different than the motion of objects, or seems to be that it has a stronger, this separate reality, if such one exists, has some kind of stronger claim to be called time. Now, at this point, I want to say specifically that he is referring to the motion of a particular object, so that time cannot be defined in reference to one particular object. For example, the motion of the sun. But perhaps it could be defined in reference to the motion of all objects. We'll see. He says time is not the movement of any corporeal object. By this he means any particular, one in particular, corporeal object. Augustine says we measure the length of a poem, for example, by how many lines it has. But we cannot tell by this method if it was sung in haste or not. He says, but the mensuration of time by these methods yields no result that is absolute. So far, we have no absolute way of measuring time. I have therefore come to the conclusion that time is nothing other than tension. But tension of what I do not know, and I will be very surprised if it is not tension of consciousness itself. Augustine continues, but how can a future which does not yet exist dwindle or be used up? And how can a past which no longer exists grow? Only because there are three realities in the mind which conducts this operation. The mind expects and attends and remembers, so that what it expects passes by way of what it attends into what it remembers. Through our attention, what is still to be makes its way into the state where it is no more. It is not, therefore, future time which is long, for it does not exist. A long future is simply an expectation of the future which represents it as long. Nor is the past a long period of time, because it does not exist at all. A long past is simply a memory of the past which represents it as long. We are aware of time through three activities. Through expectation, we are aware of the future. Through attention, we're aware of the present, and through memory, we're aware of the past. Time is measured in the present, which is the mind paying attention. What is it paying attention to? So how do we measure time? Time is subjectively perceived, according to Augustine. Does this mean that time is not real? Well, he still says that time is objectively real. We know this because we cannot think of change without time, even if we can't clearly perceive time in itself. Well, what is time? Time is tension, or time is motion and change. Again, this is not to say that time is the motion of one object, but rather time is motion itself and change itself. And the awareness of time is our attention to the tension of change. Change is tension. Change is something moving and going from one state to another. And awareness of that tension is our perception of time. And since motion can go quicker or slower, then our perception of time will end up being subjective. But the fact that things do in fact move and change is still objective, and there is a before state and an after state in change. Change refers to before and after. So therefore time exists even if it is subjectively perceived. If all motion and change paused or stopped, time would stop too, because time is that motion. One last thought experiment. What is the nearest star to Earth? Think about it for a second. Do you remember what's the nearest star to Earth? Can you think of it? The Death Star, of course. To get there, we need a spaceship. Let's pick a different spaceship. All right, that's better. Let's say this distance is 10 light years, right? A light year is a measure of distance. It's how far light travels in one Earth year, all right? So let's say the distance is 10 light years. How long will the trip take at 90% of light speed? Well, it'll take 11 years, of course. But that is from the point of view of Earth. All right, the ship will take 11 years to get to this nearest star. But how long will it take from the point of view of the ship, someone who is inside of the ship? Actually, it will take almost no time at all. The perception of time is different for those who are inside of the ship. Why? This is Einstein's theory of relativity called time. It's one aspect of that theory called time dilation. The closer you get to the speed of light, the slower change happens. And your perception of time therefore changes. So that, let's say there's a round trip. Let's say that the ship takes a trip to the Death Star and comes back, right? So this will appear to us to be, let's say, it'll be about 22 years. However, that is from the perception of those of us who stayed on Earth. And that means that those of us who stayed on Earth will be 22 years older. However, the people who were on the ship will only be a couple of years older, maybe less. Their age will have progressed less. Their perception of time will only be a couple years versus more than 20 years, and they will have aged less. Why is that the case? If time is motion, and near light speed motion slows down, then time should also slow down. Augustine's meditations show a relationship between motion and time. If all the planets and all objects in the universe slowed down, we would have no external standard to measure the rate of movement, and would thus be unaware of the difference. If everything slowed down, we wouldn't know it. That's just like how motion in the spaceship slows down, and the perception of time for the spaceman does too. Maybe Augustine was on to something. Remember that Augustine was in the 4th century AD, whereas Albert Einstein was just in the past 100 years. Maybe Augustine was a man before his time. Let's do the write-up. Augustine on time. What are some things you can learn from Augustine's style or method of doing philosophical analysis? You can take this from the video as well as from the reading. As you did the reading, what impressed you about his style or method that you can learn from? And how does Augustine's meditation on time relate to what some previous philosophers discuss about the nature of change, like the pre-Socratics or Plato or Aristotle? You tell me, how does this relate to previous thinkers?